"You're lost, darling. The service entrance is around back." The words, sharp as shards of ice, sliced through the reverent hum of the Starlight Centennial Gala. They were dropped into the vast, echoing atrium of the Museum of Modern Legacy with the deliberate carelessness of a queen discarding a bone. Dozens of heads, a constellation of diamonds and bespoke tuxedos, swiveled in unison. In the gravitational center of their stare stood Victoria Sterling Price, a third-generation heiress poured into a gown of liquid silver, a champagne flute held like a scepter. Her smile was a masterpiece of condescending artistry, designed not to welcome, but to wound. But Dr. Heiress Thorne did not flinch. She did not recoil. At 48, with her salt and pepper hair swept into an elegant, intricate braid that seemed more architectural than styled, she simply stood her ground. She was an island of stillness in a sea of shifting judgment. Her dress, a breathtaking column of fabric in the audacious color of molten gold, didn't glitter with the frantic light of 1,000 sequins. It glowed with a deep, confident heat, the color of a dawn you have to fight to see. It was the quiet, undeniable radiance of a woman who doesn't attend parties. She builds the empires that fund them. Before we even get into the guts of this story, I have to ask, where in the world are you listening from right now? Drop your city, your state, your country in the comments below. And if you believe that dignity is non-negotiable and that the world needs more stories of quiet strength, do me a favor and hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us tell the tales that matter. You're not just a viewer, you're part of a movement. Now, let's get back to the museum. The whispers started immediately, slithering across the polished marble floor like invisible snakes. "Who is that? Did you see the color of that dress? Tacky. Security must have made a mistake." They were the predictable, venomous little darts of the chronically insecure, the murmurings of people whose entire identity was built on exclusion. Victoria leaned in, a cloud of jasmine and entitlement enveloping Heiress. The silver of her dress seemed to leach the warmth from the air. "Gold, really?" she purred, her voice a low, theatrical mockery. "How ambitious. Next time, darling, do try to read the invitation. It specifies tasteful elegance, not award statuette." Heiress simply lifted her chin, her gaze as calm and ancient as granite. She had heard this tone before. Oh, yes. She'd heard it at 23, when a loan officer with a cheap tie and a smug grin had literally laughed at the business plan she'd spent 6 months perfecting. He'd slid the binder back across the desk and told her to go find a husband to fund her little hobby. She'd heard it at 32, when she was asked to wait in the hallway of her own damn company, while the all-male board she'd just acquired debated her leadership. History didn't just repeat itself. It put on a new dress, updated its jewelry, and tried to cut you with the same old knives. Tonight, history wore silver and smelled of jasmine. Victoria, annoyed by the lack of a flustered reaction, flicked her wrist. A single, perfect drop of champagne flew from her glass, landing on the marble between their shoes. It wasn't an accident. It was a warning shot. It was a punctuation mark. "This institution," Victoria announced, her voice rising just enough to command the attention of the entire atrium, "deserves patrons who understand its legacy, patrons with class, not interlopers in garish costumes." The crowd shifted, a collective rustle of silk and discomfort. The air was thick with a delicious, toxic cocktail of curiosity and second-hand cruelty. Phones, which had been politely tucked away, began to emerge from designer clutches and jacket pockets. They were held low, angled discreetly, just shy of overtly recording, but ready. Everyone smelled blood in the water. Heiress's fingers, long and steady, rested on the simple leather clutch she held. She didn't argue. She didn't defend her dress. She didn't explain who she was. Her silence was a vacuum, and it was pulling all the noise, all the judgment, all the arrogance out of the air and amplifying it. Her stillness was more profound, more unsettling than any shouted rebuttal could ever be. Across the room, a young photographer named Maya, hired to capture candid shots of laughing donors, froze. Her lens was aimed, but her finger hesitated on the shutter. Her heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was new to this world of obscene wealth and brittle smiles, but she knew, with an instinct that went beyond her training, that this was more than a catty moment. This was a tectonic plate shifting beneath the gilded floor of high society. Victoria, bathed in the golden glow of the enormous chandelier, looked like a triumphant goddess carved from ice. But the light couldn't hide the ugly, petty curl of her lips. Heiress Thorne, in her gown the color of a rising sun, didn't need the spotlight. She was her own source of gravity, an unshakable center around which the chaos of the room now revolved. The atrium was no longer a neutral space. It had become a battlefield. One woman flaunting a power she had inherited, the other wielding a power she had forged in fire. And the night, as they say, was just getting started. Heiress Thorne began to move, not away from the confrontation, but deeper into it. She walked further into the heart of the atrium, each step a deliberate, measured beat against the marble. The molten gold of her gown trailed behind her, a river of defiant light. She had no entourage of assistants, no bulky security guards clearing her path. None of the heavy, ostentatious jewelry that screamed, "I belong here" in this language of wealth. All she carried was the slim black clutch in one hand, and a composure so absolute it seemed to be a physical shield. The room, as a whole, still didn't know her. Not really. What they saw was a black woman, alone, in a dress that broke their unspoken rules. They saw an anomaly. They didn't see the global tech conglomerate she had built from a single laptop in a cramped studio apartment. They didn't see the revolutionary patents that were running the very phones they were now using to secretly record her. And they certainly didn't know that she had, just 3 weeks prior, anonymously channeled a staggering $8.5 billion into the very museum foundation hosting this centennial gala. Her anonymity wasn't an accident. It was a scalpel. It was an experiment. Heiress had played this game before, on smaller, less glamorous stages. She remembered being 25, standing in the rain outside a venture capital firm in Silicon Valley. She'd been 15 minutes early for a pitch meeting, but the receptionist had looked at her jeans and worn blazer and refused to let her in, assuming she was a delivery person. She'd missed the meeting. She'd sat in her car, soaked and humiliated, and cried for exactly 10 minutes. Then she had dried her eyes, driven home, and rewritten her code to be twice as efficient. A decade later, that same venture capital firm had begged to invest in her company. She'd let them, at a valuation that made their eyes water. Tonight's dress wasn't just silk and thread. It was a memory. It was a statement. It was defiance woven into couture. It was the armor of a woman who had learned that the only way to beat a rigged game was to buy the whole casino. A young server, his hands trembling almost imperceptibly as he balanced a tray of crystal flutes, navigated his way through the crowd. Heiress took a glass from him, her fingers steady, her eyes never leaving the room. She offered the boy a small, almost imperceptible nod of gratitude, a gesture of shared humanity in a room that was rapidly losing its own. The whispers continued their relentless assault. "I heard she crashed the after-party last year, too. Someone should call Marcus from the board." Victoria's clique of admirers, women with identical hairstyles and surgically perfected smiles, let out a soft, synchronized titter of laughter. Their eyes darted between Heiress and the grand stage at the far end of the atrium, where the Chicago Philharmonic was tuning its instruments, a delicate prelude to a far more brutal opera. Victoria Sterling Price wanted the spotlight. She craved it. Heiress was content to let her have it, for now, because Heiress understood a fundamental truth about power that Victoria never would. True power isn't in the volume of your voice. It's in the patience of your silence. It's in the clarity of your observation. It's in watching, really watching, how people behave when they believe you have nothing to offer them. This gala was her laboratory, and Victoria Sterling Price had just nominated herself as the lead test subject. Near the sweeping marble staircase, a journalist named Ben leaned against a pillar, his notebook half hidden. He recognized her. He was almost sure of it. He'd seen that face in the pages of Forbes, of Wired, of Fortune. But it was a cognitive dissonance he couldn't resolve. The Dr. Heiress Thorne he'd read about was a titan, a recluse, a legend who didn't do galas. She wouldn't be here, alone, being dressed down by a socialite. The fear of being wrong, of looking like a fool, kept his mouth shut. So instead, he jotted down notes, his pen flying across the page. V. Sterling Price publicly accosts unidentified guest. Dress color, gold, is the apparent offense. Tension palpable. He had no idea, not yet, that he wasn't just documenting a moment of socialite cruelty. He was documenting the precise moment the Sterling family legacy began to crumble into dust. Heiress raised her champagne flute, not in a toast, but in a quiet moment of self-possession. She took a slow, deliberate sip. The bubbles sparkled, catching the light of the chandeliers, but her eyes weren't wandering. For a brief, charged second, they locked again with Victoria's. Victoria smirked, a lazy, confident expression that said the game was already won. But Heiress's silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy. The grand concert hall beyond the atrium doors was waiting for its curtain to rise. But here, in this cold, marble corridor of power and privilege, another performance was already well underway. And it was not going to end with a standing ovation for Victoria Sterling Price. The orchestra's tuning forks faded into a civilized hum, a signal that the main event was about to begin. But in the atrium, the tension had only coiled tighter, vibrating with a venomous energy. Victoria Sterling Price, a true performer, knew you never let a good moment of drama go to waste. Her silver heels clicked an aggressive rhythm on the marble as she closed the distance, circling Heiress like a shark that had scented weakness. "Darling," Victoria drawled, her voice a syrupy blend of champagne and pure condescension. "I feel I must educate you. This is the Starlight Centennial Gala. It represents 100 years of culture, of philanthropy, of families like mine. It's black tie, it's couture, it's about a certain standard. Not whatever this dazzling little science experiment is that you're wearing." She gestured with a dismissive flick of her wrist at Heiress's gown, a gesture designed to erase, not to admire. A few nearby guests, emboldened by her cruelty, chuckled. It wasn't a loud, boisterous laughter. It was something far worse. The quiet, conspiratorial snickering of people who were delighted to see someone else put in their place. Heiress kept her shoulders square, her glass held perfectly steady. The light seemed to gather in the golden silk of her dress, igniting it, making it burn even brighter against the sterile backdrop of the museum. Leo, the young usher at the main podium, was barely 21. He was a scholarship student at the Art Institute, working this gig to pay for his supplies. His eyes, wide with a mixture of fear and outrage, darted between the silver heiress and the silent woman in gold. His training packet had a whole section on VIPs. Accommodate, anticipate, assume hierarchy based on appearance. Tonight, that training felt like poison. He looked like he wanted to step forward, to say something, but an invisible wall of class and consequence held him in place. Victoria leaned closer still, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial hiss that was somehow more piercing than a shout. "It's always the same with you people. New money, or more likely, no money at all. You think you can just buy your way in, but you never learn the codes, do you? You simply don't have the breeding." The words, ugly and ancient, curled into the air like toxic smoke. Heiress didn't reply. She didn't need to. She just tilted her head slightly, her gaze unwavering. That profound stillness, that absolute refusal to be rattled, was beginning to unnerve Victoria far more than a screaming match ever could. The silence wasn't a void. It was a presence. It was a mirror reflecting Victoria's own ugliness back at her, and the crowd was seeing it all. A man in a navy tuxedo whispered to his wife, "Good Lord, who even let her in?" His wife, tugging anxiously at a 3-strand pearl necklace, muttered, "Marcus really needs to have security check the credentials at the door more carefully." The poison was spreading, a ripple of suspicion staining the atmosphere. For Victoria, this was still not enough. She needed a bigger reaction, a climax. She raised her voice again, projecting it so that everyone in the atrium became her audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, lifting her glass high like a toastmaster at a banquet. "The Museum of Modern Legacy deserves patrons who belong here, not imposters in tacky gold dresses trying to play dress-up with their betters." A collective, sharp intake of breath swept the foyer, a gasp that was part horror, part thrill. Some guests frowned, looking down at their shoes with a sudden, acute sense of discomfort. Others looked subtly relieved, as if Victoria had finally said the quiet part out loud for them. Phones were no longer discreet. Lenses were raised. The show was too good to miss. Heiress remained anchored in the storm, unshaken. This was nothing. This was a playground squabble compared to the wars she had fought and won. She had walked into hostile acquisition meetings that were calculated to bankrupt her. She had endured boardrooms filled with men twice her age who called her honey while trying to steal her intellectual property. This atrium was just another boardroom with better lighting and worse acoustics. Her calm wasn't weakness. It was a weapon forged in the fires of 100 past insults. The young usher, Leo, took a half-step back into the shadows, the shame on his face stark and clear. Ben, the journalist by the pillar, was scribbling so furiously he thought his pen might catch fire, and somewhere in the back, a cellist in her rehearsal blacks, heading for the stage, whispered to her stand partner, "Wait a second, I think that's Heiress Thorne, from the cover of Time." But the whisper was lost in the rising drama. For now, it didn't matter. Victoria had thrown down her gauntlet. The gala had found its main event, and Dr. Heiress Thorne, silent, steady, and dangerously underestimated, was standing at its absolute center. The air in the atrium was now so thick with unspoken words it felt hard to breathe. The murmurings had ceased, replaced by a focused, predatory silence. Every single person was waiting for Heiress Thorne to break, to cry, to scream, to defend herself, to give Victoria the explosive scene she so clearly craved. But Heiress did not move. She stood as if she were a statue cast from bronze, one hand resting on the stem of her champagne glass, the other on her clutch. Her silence wasn't empty space. It was a deliberate, tactical pressure. Victoria tilted her head, a flicker of genuine confusion crossing her features before the mask of arrogance slammed back down. "What's the matter?" she sneered, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. "Cat got your tongue? Or did you forget the lines you rehearsed for crashing this party?" Heiress took a slow, deep breath, letting the pause stretch into an uncomfortable eternity. Her brand of calm was a unique form of torture for people like Victoria. It was the kind of stillness that made people antsy, that forced them to listen to the echo of their own cruelty in the silence that followed. Around her, a few guests began to cough, shuffling their feet, as if the sheer weight of the quiet was physically pressing down on them. A memory surfaced in Heiress's mind, sharp and unwelcome. She was 23 again, standing in the lobby of a budget hotel for a tech conference. The clerk, a man with tired eyes and a stained uniform, was insisting her credit card had been declined. She knew it hadn't. She had checked the balance an hour before. She had spoken calmly, then pleaded, then argued, trying to explain that it must be a mistake, that she had nowhere else to go. He had just stared through her with bovine indifference and told her to leave. She'd spent that night sleeping in her car, the shame coiling in her gut. She'd learned a powerful lesson that night. Words, when you have no power, are just noise. Silence, when you do, is a verdict. Tonight, she would not plead. Silence would let the guilty convict themselves. She raised her flute and took another sip of champagne, her hand as steady as a surgeon's. The soft fizz of the bubbles was the only sound in her immediate vicinity. Even Leo, the young usher, seemed to be holding his breath. Victoria shifted her weight from one silver heel to the other, a small, agitated movement. Her entire performance was predicated on getting a reaction. Gasps, tears, outrage, defense. Heiress's stillness denied her that. It was a mirror, and it was showing the entire, glittering crowd the reflection of a petty, cruel bully. And mirrors, in a room full of people obsessed with their own image, were very dangerous things. A man near the staircase whispered to his companion, "She's not even rattled! It's unnerving!" His companion, a woman draped in sapphires, frowned. "That's what's so bizarre. Anyone else would have run out of here in tears by now." Heiress finally allowed her gaze to sweep across the room. It wasn't a hurried, desperate scan for an ally. It was a slow, methodical assessment. She looked at the smirking faces, the uncomfortable ones, the curious ones. She looked at the journalist. She looked at the photographer. She looked at the usher. Witnesses. She looked at Victoria last, her own expression a perfect, unreadable mask. There was no anger there, no humiliation, just a profound, chilling patience. Ben, the journalist, scribbled harder, muttering under his breath, "She's holding the line, like she's waiting for backup." He didn't know how right he was. The backup wasn't coming through the door. It was in her pocket. Victoria clicked her heels on the marble again, a desperate, sharp sound to break the spell. "Pathetic," she spat, her voice climbing in pitch, a frantic attempt to reclaim dominance. "You can't even form a sentence to defend yourself." And then, for the first time, Heiress's lips moved. They curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. It was a warning. It was a signal. It was the silent, terrifying moment when the prey reveals it has been the hunter all along. This wasn't her losing ground. This was her setting the trap. The grand atrium, once a stage for polite society, had fully transformed. It was no longer a party. It was a tribunal. And Dr. Heiress Thorne, by saying absolutely nothing, had already delivered a closing argument that damned her accuser more effectively than any speech could. She had turned Victoria's cruelty into the prosecution's star exhibit. At the edge of the crowd, a small, pulsing red light came to life. Maya, the young photographer, had finally made her choice. She wasn't just an event photographer anymore. She was a journalist. Swallowing her fear, she quietly tapped the record button on her phone. She didn't aim the lens directly at their faces, not yet. She was smarter than that. She angled it low, capturing a guerrilla-style tableau, the flash of silver sequins, the steady glow of the gold dress, the trembling champagne flutes in the hands of onlookers, the strained, false smiles of a crowd pretending not to watch the most interesting thing that had ever happened to them. She wasn't alone. Ben, the journalist, gripped his notepad like it was a life raft. He had come here expecting to write 1,000 boring words on philanthropy and fashion. Instead, he was watching the public execution of a reputation, live and under chandeliers. His pen scratched furiously. Sterling price escalates humiliation of guest. Victim silence is her only defense. It holds stronger than outrage. A woman in a midnight blue gown whispered to her partner, a real estate tycoon. "Darling, isn't that Thorne, from Ellis Global?" Her partner shook his head dismissively. "Don't be ridiculous, Helen. Heiress Thorne wouldn't be caught dead at one of these things, and she certainly wouldn't come alone." But the seed of doubt had been planted. It was a tiny spark, but the room was filled with dry tinder. Heiress remained motionless, her presence a steady, burning flame against the cold drafts of derision. She could feel the tide turning. In every hostile negotiation, in every boardroom battle, there was a precise moment when the witnesses stopped being passive observers and became active participants, even if only in their minds. She could feel that moment arriving now. Leo, the usher, swallowed hard. His eyes, no longer darting, were fixed on Heiress. His training told him to obey the hierarchy, to trust the woman in the silver dress whose family name was literally carved into the museum's donor wall. But his gut, his soul, was telling him something else entirely. It was telling him that the woman in gold possessed a power the sterling heiress could never comprehend. His hand twitched towards the intercom button on his podium, his finger hovering over the switch for security. He didn't press it. Victoria, sensing the shift, sensing her control slipping, decided to double down. She raised her voice, deliberately, to make sure it carried over the suddenly silent orchestra. "I honestly don't know how security could have made such an embarrassing mistake," she announced, "but I will be speaking to the board. We'll make sure that next year only real patrons get through the front door." A murmur of agreement rippled through some of the older guests. But it was weaker this time. One voice, small but clear, cut through the tension. It came from the cellist, still standing by the stage door, her instrument case held tight against her side. "That's no way to treat a person," she said. "Gala or no gala." The words hung in the air, fragile but undeniable, a tiny crack in the dam of complicity. Maya's camera finally tilted up. She framed the shot perfectly, catching Heiress's profound stillness head-on. For the first time, the focus of the room was not on Victoria's glittering aggression, but on the unshakable dignity of the woman who refused to be diminished by it. The atmosphere of the atrium had fundamentally changed. It was no longer a one-sided beatdown. Now there were witnesses, eyes recording, pens racing, consciences stirring, and Heiress Thorne, without raising her voice a single decibel, had just turned a private insult into a public record. The cellist's quiet protest should have been a warning flare for Victoria, a signal to de-escalate. Instead, it was like throwing gasoline on a fire. Victoria's laugh, high, brittle, and stripped of all its earlier confidence, shattered the tense quiet. "Oh, please," she scoffed, executing a slow, dramatic turn to ensure everyone could appreciate her profile against the chandelier's glow. "Are we really going to pretend this woman belongs here? She doesn't even understand the most basic elements of a dress code." Her gaze raked over Heiress's gown one more time, her voice curdling with a final desperate surge of disdain. "Gold, the color of cheap trophies, the color of..." of staff uniforms at a lesser hotel. A sharp, horrified gasp echoed from the direction of the donor wall. A few guests took a physical step back, as if Victoria's toxicity had become radioactive. Leo, the usher, gripped the edge of his podium so hard his knuckles turned white. His training manual had a chapter on de-escalation, on handling difficult guests. It had nothing about how to handle a board trustee's daughter behaving like a monster. Heiress's stillness remained absolute. She carefully placed her now empty champagne glass on a passing server's tray, her movements fluid and unhurried, as if Victoria's words were nothing more than background noise, less significant than the fizzing bubbles she had just consumed. Her calm was no longer just a shield. It was an active weapon, and it was driving Victoria mad. From the stairwell, Ben the journalist spoke before he could stop himself. "That's completely uncalled for." The words came out low, a guttural rumble of protest, but in the supercharged silence, they carried like a gunshot. Head swiveled in his direction. Victoria's gaze snapped toward him, her eyes chips of ice. "And who might you be?" she asked, her voice a sickly sweet poison. "Ah, the press. Always so hungry for a little drama. Be careful, darling. You might find yourself writing your little articles from outside the velvet rope if you choose to side with the wrong people." Ben froze, his pen hovering over the page. The threat was not subtle. Around him, the crowd's whispers intensified, feeding the cruel theater of it all. Then, Victoria delivered what she intended to be the killing blow. She strode forward, closing the final few feet between them, until she was well inside Heiress's personal space. And with a flick of her wrist as quick and vicious as a striking snake, she snatched Heiress's simple black clutch right out of her hand. Gasps exploded across the atrium, a genuine unified sound of shock. She dangled the clutch from her manicured fingers like it was contaminated evidence. "Let's see what's inside, shall we?" she taunted, her voice giddy with her own audacity. "An invitation? Credentials? Or just a ticket stub from the nosebleed seats you snuck away from?" A murmur of real distress finally swept the room. Someone muttered, "My God, that's theft." Another woman hissed, "She can't do that." But no one moved. No one dared to step into the ring with the raging bull. Heiress didn't lunge for her bag. She didn't shout. She simply extended her empty hand, palm up, her eyes locked on Victoria's. It was not a plea. It was not a request. It was a silent, unequivocal command. The foyer was vibrating now, a palpable hum of shared anxiety. Victoria, drunk on the attention, smirked, still dangling the clutch. But she had finally, fatally, miscalculated. She had crossed an invisible, sacred line. This was no longer just verbal ridicule. This was a physical violation. This was public, premeditated humiliation. And Heiress Thorne, still wordless, was calmly letting the heiress dig her own grave, one reckless, theatrical shovelful at a time, in front of 100 witnesses with recording devices. The black leather clutch dangled from Victoria Sterling Price's fingers, a stolen trophy in the glittering light. The entire atrium seemed to hold its breath, every guest a frozen statue in a tableau of disbelief. Heiress Thorne remained at the center of the vortex, her hand still extended, her palm open and waiting. "So curious, aren't we?" Victoria cooed, shaking the clutch so its small silver clasp rattled. "These people, they walk in here, pretending they belong, and they think their silence is a cloak of invisibility. Well, let's just test that theory." With a sharp, theatrical flick of her thumb, she unfastened the clasp. She turned the clutch upside down. The contents spilled out, scattering across the cold, unforgiving marble. A slim, black smartphone, a heavy, expensive-looking fountain pen, and a folded program for the evening's performance. Nothing more, A fresh wave of gasps rippled through the crowd, a sound of shock mixed with the grim satisfaction of watching a car crash. Victoria bent down, a difficult maneuver in her restrictive gown, and snatched the folded program, holding it aloft as if it were proof of treason. "See?" she announced, her voice ringing with triumph. "No invitation, no donor badge, nothing. Exactly as I suspected. An imposter. A fraud, crashing the Starlight Centennial Gala." A woman in pearls whispered, far too loudly, "How utterly humiliating for her." Another man muttered to his friend, "Victoria is going way too far this time." Still, nobody moved. Heiress finally lowered her hand. Her gaze was as steady as the polar star. Her voice did not rise. She did not plead or protest. She simply bent at the waist, a movement of impossible grace, retrieved her fountain pen from the floor and slid it back into the open clutch, which Victoria had carelessly dropped. That composure, that absolute refusal to grant Victoria the satisfaction of a reaction, seemed to break something in the heiress. A hot, ugly flush crept up her neck, staining her pale skin. "Don't you ignore me!" she snapped, her voice finally cracking, becoming shrill and tinny against the marble walls. She stepped closer, invading Heiress's space, and with a final act of reckless, champagne-fueled bravado, she tipped her own glass, emptying the last of its contents onto the hem of Heiress's golden gown. The pale liquid splashed down, staining the magnificent silk like a fresh wound. The room finally, collectively gasped as one. This was the point of no return. A dozen phones, no longer hiding, tilted higher. Their lenses were now open, shameless, hungry. Maya, the photographer, whispered, "Oh my God, she really did it," as her finger held steady on the record button. Heiress's hands remained still at her sides. Her posture did not break, did not even tremble, as the cold champagne soaked into fabric that cost more than Victoria's entire outfit. Her silence deepened, transcending restraint and becoming something else entirely. It was an indictment. It was a mirror held up not just to Victoria, but to every single person in that room who had watched and done nothing. It forced them all to confront what had just been done, not to some anonymous gatecrasher, but to a woman they had profoundly, catastrophically underestimated. Ben, the journalist, muttered to himself, "This isn't a scene anymore. This is evidence." He scribbled faster, his pen strokes hard and angry. Victoria, drunk on the gasps she mistook for applause, smirked wider. "See," she said, spreading her arms wide as if to embrace her audience. Not even a single protest, because she knows she doesn't belong. She mistook their horror for her victory. But the atmosphere in the atrium no longer hummed with their complicity. It was buzzing with something new, something sharper, anger, discomfort. And for a few, the dawning, terrifying light of recognition. The cellist gripped her instrument case like a shield. The usher, Leo, took a half-step forward, then stopped himself. Maya's little red light blinked, steady and unforgiving. Dr. Heiress Thorne stood in the center of it all, golden silk clinging damply to her skin, her eyes clear and unflinching. She didn't shout. She didn't hit back. She had allowed Victoria to write the final damning line of her own story in front of a room full of witnesses who were about to realize they weren't watching a humiliation. They were watching an abdication. They were watching history turn on a dime. The champagne still glistened on the hem of Heiress Thorne's gown, a dark stain under the brilliant light of the chandeliers. When she finally moved, it was not with anger or haste. It was with the slow, deliberate precision of a chess master who has seen the board 20 moves ahead. She bent down, retrieving her phone from the marble with the same calm she might use to pick up a dropped glove. The atrium held its collective breath. Victoria Sterling Price smirked, a final flickering ember of arrogance, certain she had won, certain she had finally broken the woman in gold. Heiress lifted the phone. She pressed a single button on the screen, and she spoke, her voice not loud, but carrying with an astonishing clarity, a cool, crisp tone that sliced through the charged air. "Jasmine, initiate the Phoenix Protocol." Her voice was so steady, so devoid of emotion, it was terrifying. On the other end of the line, a woman's reply came back, just as efficient, just as immediate. "Confirmed, Dr. Thorne. Protocol is active. Do you wish to proceed with the full withdrawal?" Heiress's eyes, cold and clear as diamonds, never left Victoria's face as she answered. "Yes, begin the immediate transfer of all endowments and pledged funds from the Sterling Price Foundation portfolio. All of them. Effective now." The words struck the room with the force of a physical blow. A disbelieving ripple spread through the crowd as a handful of guests, bankers, fund managers, fellow philanthropists, instinctively reached for their own phones, their faces suddenly pale. Ben, the journalist, froze mid-word, his mind struggling to process the sheer scale of what he'd just heard. The cellist's mouth fell open in shock. Victoria's laugh was a brittle, panicked thing. "What? What on earth are you babbling about?" she stammered, tossing her hair in a gesture that was meant to be dismissive, but just looked desperate. "You can't. You don't have that kind of authority." But Heiress's calm was a mountain. "You publicly humiliated me at a gala my foundation underwrites," she stated, each word a perfectly polished stone of fact. "You assaulted me in a museum whose centennial fund I personally established. $8.5 billion of my money currently sits as the bedrock of your family's philanthropic name. As of 90 seconds ago, it no longer does." A stunned, horrified silence crashed down upon the marble hall. For the first time all night, Victoria's smirk did not just falter, it evaporated. The usher, Leo, leaned over to his colleague, whispering frantically. Ben, the journalist, finally found his pen again, scribbling a single, bolded line. "She's pulling the entire foundation." Heiress slipped her phone back into her clutch, the leather still cool and damp from the spilled champagne, and closed it with a soft, final click. Her actions were surgical. Each movement was precise, deliberate, and devastating. The room no longer saw a woman in a stained dress. They saw a force of nature recalibrating the very ground beneath their feet. Victoria sputtered, her words tripping and falling over each other. That's insane! You can't just—" She turned to the crowd, her eyes wide and pleading, desperately seeking the support and complicity that had been there just moments before. But the faces were no longer mirroring her triumph. They were masks of shock, of dawning comprehension, and of a raw, primal fear. Heiress Thorne still did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. Every syllable she spoke now was an earthquake. "You wanted a stage, Miss Sterling Price," she said, her voice resonating with a quiet, terrible finality. "Here it is. Let's let the world see what your arrogance truly costs." The atrium, once a theater for Victoria's ridicule, had shifted again. It was no longer her performance. It was Heiress's reckoning. Silent, steady, and absolutely, terrifyingly real. For a long, breathless moment, the only sound in the atrium was the faint, frantic buzzing of a dozen phones, switching from camera mode to financial news alerts. All eyes were locked on Heiress Thorne, waiting for the justification, the explanation, the emotional outburst. She offered them none of it. Instead, she took 2 steps forward, positioning herself in the absolute center of the marble floor. Her gown, stained hem and all, seemed to burn with an inner fire, a flame that refused to be quenched by champagne or contempt. She met Victoria's terrified gaze head-on, and with the unshakable poise of a woman who had been underestimated her entire life, she finally spoke. "You wanted to know if I belonged here," her voice carried, clear and unhurried, to every corner of the silent room. "So allow me to be perfectly clear. I am Dr. Heiress Thorne, founder and CEO of Helios Innovations, and I am the anonymous benefactor who established, funded, and is, as of this moment, the single largest donor to this museum's centennial foundation." The words detonated in the silence, like a string of explosions. Conversations died mid-breath. Ben, the journalist's pen, stopped moving. Maya, the photographer's camera, still recording, trembled in her hands as she captured the reveal. Heiress didn't pause. She let the truth build, layer by devastating layer. "For the past 5 years, my company's philanthropic arm, the Phoenix Foundation, has quietly underwritten your scholarships, your acquisitions, your new international wing. That donor wall you're so proud of?" She gestured with her chin towards the far wall. "My money paid for the marble it's carved from. $8.5 billion of funding. My name wasn't on the plaque, but it was on every single check. Tonight, it leaves yours." Gasps, sharp and painful, ripped through the crowd. The woman in pearls clutched her husband's arm so tightly he winced. Leo the usher whispered, "I knew it. I knew it," his voice thick with vindication. His colleague stared, wide-eyed and pale, as if the floor itself had become insubstantial. Victoria's face was a ruin, completely drained of color. The blood had fled, leaving behind a waxy, translucent mask of disbelief. She opened her mouth, but only a dry, croaking sound came out. No, that's not possible," she finally stammered. "My family, our foundation—" Heiress cut her off, not by raising her voice, but by lowering it, making it even more lethally focused. "Your family's foundation was a legacy I was willing to sustain. And as of this moment, it is a legacy I have chosen to withdraw. You mocked the woman who paid for your name to be etched in stone. You poured champagne on the very hands that have been signing the checks that give you the right to stand in this room." This time Ben found his voice, muttering into his notepad. "This isn't a collapse anymore. This is a demolition." He scribbled the words down, his handwriting a frantic scrawl, as if history itself were a fleeting thing he had to trap on paper. Guests shifted from foot to foot, their faces a gallery of dawning horror and recognition. They had laughed, they had whispered, they had doubted. Now, in a sickening wave of clarity, they realized they had not been spectators at a humiliation. They had been unwitting accomplices at their own institution's financial disembowelment. Heiress turned, her gaze sweeping over not just Victoria, but every single person in the atrium. "You think power is a birthright?" she said, her voice a clarion call of judgment. "You think it drips down through family names and donor plaques. But real power, lasting power, is built. It is built brick by brick, code by code, year by year. It is built by the very people you have spent your lives trying to keep out of your rooms." Her voice did not rise. It didn't have to. Each word landed with the final, absolute weight of a gavel. And in that stunning, world-altering instant, Dr. Heiress Thorne was no longer a guest in a gold dress. She was the storm they had so arrogantly invited into their marble sanctuary. She was patient, she was deliberate, and she was utterly, unstoppably magnificent. The foyer didn't just erupt, it fractured. The stunned silence shattered into 1,000 shards of panicked noise. Gasps collided with frantic whispers. 100 different conversations started at once, each one desperate, each one drowned out by the next. The massive crystal chandeliers seemed to vibrate with the sheer chaos of it all. The woman in the pearl necklace, who had smirked so smugly just 20 minutes ago, was now staring at Heiress with wide, terrified eyes. Her hand was clamped over her mouth. 8.5 billion? She whispered to her husband, the number itself seeming to physically choke her. Her husband wasn't listening. He was fumbling with his phone, his thumb swiping frantically, trying to pull up the museum's public financial disclosures. Near the podium, Leo the usher sagged against the stand, a shudder of pure, unadulterated shock running through him. The line between his training manual and the raw, unvarnished truth had just been obliterated. She owns them, he muttered, his voice thin with awe. His colleague just nodded numbly, his own phone screen displaying a breaking news alert from the Wall Street Journal. Helios Innovations, CEO Heiress Thorne pulls multi-billion endowment from Museum of Modern Legacy in apparent dispute. Ben the journalist scribbled with the frantic energy of a man who knows he's witnessing history. Sterling Price mocks benefactor in public. Legacy evaporates in real time. He had come to cover an opera gala. He was now, instead, recording the live, public implosion of one of Chicago's most powerful and storied families. The cellist clutched her instrument case to her chest. She told the truth, she said softly, more to herself than to anyone else, but her voice carried in the chaos. A palpable wave of shame radiated from the guests nearest her. They knew. They had stood by, silent at best, complicit at worst. And now they were all standing in the wreckage. Phones were out everywhere now, no longer hiding, no longer discreet. Their screens lit up the atrium like 1,000 tiny torches. Guests weren't just recording, they were live streaming, tweeting, texting. They wanted proof. They wanted receipts. They wanted viral, undeniable evidence that they were there the night the Sterling Price dynasty was stripped bare for the world to see. Victoria stood frozen, a statue of crumbling arrogance. Her silver sequin dress, which had seemed so powerful moments ago, now looked cheap and gaudy under the harsh glare of 100 smartphone screens. Her smirk was a distant memory, replaced by a desperate, ugly tightness around her mouth. "She's lying," she sputtered, but her voice was a cracked, brittle thing, devoid of all conviction. "This is a trick, a stunt." But the crowd was no longer listening. Their allegiance had shifted. They had already chosen their new reality, and it was the woman in the gold dress. The gala's event director, a man named Marcus in a perfectly tailored tuxedo with beads of sweat blooming on his forehead, finally pushed his way through the stunned crowd. His face was ashen, his hands twisting together nervously. "Dr. Thorne," he stammered, his voice cracking. We had no idea you were in attendance this evening. On behalf of the museum—" Heiress didn't even look at him. She didn't have to. Her continued silence was acknowledgement enough, and it was a condemnation, too. Around them, the panic metastasized. Donors began whispering frantically to each other about contracts, about stock prices, about what the sudden, violent vanishing of $8.5 billion would mean for the museum's stability, and for their own portfolios tied to it. A woman muttered, "Our new scholarship program, the international exhibit." Her partner cut her off with a sharp shake of his head. They both knew the truth. It was all gone. The marble atrium had become a courtroom. The verdict had been delivered, and Victoria Sterling Price was guilty. Not just of cruelty, but of an arrogance so profound, so blind, that it had led her to personally detonate her own family's legacy. And Dr. Heiress Thorne, the woman they had mocked, doubted, and physically assaulted, now stood as the silent, magnificent executioner of their gilded illusions. Just when you think it can't get more intense, it does. This is a masterclass in power and consequence. Before we witness the final act, if you're finding value in this story, take a second to hit that subscribe button. We bring you stories like this every week, stories that challenge the status quo. Join the community. Now, for the final curtain. The crowd's panic was a living thing now, a thrumming, chaotic energy that filled the vast atrium. Phones were buzzing, a symphony of alerts signaling the digital shockwave that was already spreading across the globe. Donors were huddled in small, panicked groups, whispering of financial ruin. And through it all, Dr. Heiress Thorne hadn't raised her voice once. She didn't need to. True power doesn't shout. It simply acts. She turned her head slowly, a deliberate, regal movement, until her gaze fell upon the event director, Marcus, who was still wringing his hands near the grand donor wall. Her voice was calm, but it sliced through the chaos with the precision of a laser. "Effective immediately," she said. "Remove the Sterling Price name from that wall." The man's face went from ashen to snow white. His eyes darted desperately toward Victoria, then back to Heiress, as if he were searching for a loophole, for a permission slip he no longer needed. "Dr. Thorne," he stammered, his voice pleading. That plaque was unveiled just last year. It's solid bronze." Heiress's gaze was unyielding. "Then tonight, you will unveil the truth." A collective, horrified gasp swept the room. Every head turned, every neck craned toward the enormous gilded plaque mounted on the wall. The Sterling Price Family Foundation, principal benefactor. The inscription glittered under the chandeliers, suddenly looking as fragile and hollow as gold leaf. Victoria lunged forward, her composure completely shattered, her voice breaking into shrill, ugly fragments. "You can't! That wall, that name, it's ours!" Heiress didn't move toward her. She didn't even acknowledge the outburst. Instead, she lifted her phone one last time and tapped the screen. "Jasmine," she instructed, her voice still perfectly level. "Confirm the public removal clause." On the other end, her assistant's voice chimed, clear and final as a death knell. "Authorization logged, Dr. Thorne. The Sterling Price Foundation has officially been stripped of all benefactor status and naming rights. The public announcement is live." The director flinched as his own phone vibrated violently in his pocket. He pulled it out. His face seemed to age 10 years as he read the live alert from the Associated Press that was now on his screen. The headline was stark. "Heiress Thorne revokes 8.5B endowment. Orders Sterling Price name removed from Museum of Modern Legacy." The whispers became shouts. Guests crowded around each other's screens. Maya's camera lens zoomed in, capturing the raw, unfolding history. The cellist closed her eyes for a moment, as if to steady herself against the sheer magnitude of the fallout. Victoria staggered back, her silver sequins catching the light like shattered glass. "This isn't real," she whispered, shaking her head, her eyes wide and vacant. "It can't be real." But reality was already being carved into history, line by line, live stream by live stream. Dr. Heiress Thorne had written her verdict, and the entire world was reading it in real time. The director bowed his head in defeat, his voice a dry rasp. "As you wish, Dr. Thorne." He gestured weakly to 2 uniformed museum staff members. They moved forward, hesitantly, tools in hand, their faces pale with the shock of their task. The sound of a power drill biting into marble sliced through the foyer. Each metallic grind was a sentence being served. Each twist of a screw was another nail in the coffin of the Sterling Price dynasty. Heiress didn't watch them work. She didn't have to. Her eyes were fixed on the room itself, on every witness who had watched cruelty masquerade as class, only to see it collapse under the weight of its own arrogance. When the final bolt was loosened, and the heavy bronze plaque was carefully lowered into 2 pairs of trembling hands, a profound, absolute silence fell over the room. The Sterling Price name had vanished. All that remained was a faint, rectangular outline on the marble, like a ghost. The foyer lay in stunned silence, broken only by the faint, shuffling sound of the workers carrying the plaque away, like pallbearers removing a casket. Guests who had once smirked with Victoria now stared at the floor, at their own expensive shoes, their pearls and cufflinks suddenly feeling like cheap costumes. Phones were still held high, recording the empty space on the wall, but even the sound of digital shutters seemed muted, absorbed by the gravity of what had just transpired. Dr. Heiress Thorne stood alone at the center of it all. Her gown, still damp with the ghost of a champagne stain, glowed like a triumphant fire against the cold marble. She had not shouted. She had not begged. She had simply allowed arrogance to expose itself, and then she had dismantled it, piece by piece, with quiet, devastating precision. Victoria Sterling Price swayed on her silver heels, her dress now nothing more than a gaudy costume for a tragedy she had written and starred in. Her lips trembled, searching for words that no longer existed. In the space of an hour, she had gone from queen to cautionary tale. Heiress stepped forward, not toward Victoria, but addressing the entire crowd. Her eyes swept across their faces, steady and unflinching. When she spoke, her words were not a performance. They were the moral of the story. "You think silence means weakness," she said, her voice even and clear. "You think it means compliance, but silence can be power. Silence can be patience. And tonight, silence exposed the truth when shouting never could." No one dared to move. Not even the clink of a glass broke the stillness. Heiress's gaze lingered on the empty space on the wall. Power is not inherited. It is not a name carved in metal. Real power is built. It is earned. It is forged in every fire you are forced to walk through every door you are told is not for you, by every person who mistakes your grace for weakness. Ben the journalist, by the stairs, scribbled the words down verbatim, his hand shaking not from fear, but from awe. The cellist clutched her case, her eyes burning with unshed tears of admiration. The usher, Leo, stood ramrod straight, his face a mask of galvanized resolve. Heiress turned back to the room one last time. "You wanted me out of your gala," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow louder than any shout. "Instead, I walked out with your foundation. Remember this night. Remember it the next time you look at someone and decide, based on nothing but your own prejudice, who does and does not belong." She lifted her clutch, still scarred by the champagne, and tucked it under her arm. The movement was final, sharper than any curtain drop. Then she turned and moved towards the grand exit. Her heels clicked a measured, powerful rhythm on the marble, each step echoing louder than Victoria's insults ever had. The crowd parted for her without a word, a corridor of stunned, silent respect carved through their ranks. Phones recorded her departure, but no one spoke. For the first time all evening, Heiress Thorne was not invisible. She was the only thing anyone could see. At the massive, arched doorway, she paused. She stood for a moment beneath the grand chandelier, its light catching her golden gown, making it look like the dawn was breaking right there in the hall. She left them with one last sentence, a final, unforgettable truth that would echo in that room long after the lights were dimmed. "You don't need to applaud for me," she said, her voice resonating with the quiet power of a promise fulfilled. "I am the reason the music plays in here at all." And with that, Dr. Heiress Thorne stepped out into the cool Chicago night, leaving behind a shattered legacy, 100 stunned witnesses, and a silent, empty space on a marble wall. This story is a powerful reminder that true strength isn't about being the loudest person in the room. It's about integrity, patience, and knowing your own value, even when others try to diminish it. What did you take away from Heiress's story? Let me know in the comments. And please, if this moved you, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Like, subscribe, and join us in celebrating the quiet storms who are changing the world. Until next time, stand in your power.